When racist teens targeted a pregnant black woman at a bus stop, Eminem didn't just stand by. What he did next left everyone speechless. Subscribe now and tell us, what would you have done in his place? The morning crept into Detroit like an old, reluctant friend. Light filtered weakly through the grimy windows of Janice's small apartment, casting faint shadows on the scuffed linoleum floor. She sat at the edge of her worn couch, her hands resting gently on her rounded belly. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound in the room. Outside, faint echoes of life drifted in, the muffled laughter of children playing on the street below, the rhythmic thud of a basketball bouncing off cracked pavement, and the distant rumble of a passing truck. Janice had been awake for hours, her mind restless. The weight of her pregnancy wasn't just physical. It was emotional, a constant reminder of how much her life had changed over the past year. She rubbed her belly absent-mindedly, as if to soothe the baby inside her, or perhaps herself. At 8 months along, everything about her life felt heavier, harder. Her small apartment was a testament to her resilience. Though the wallpaper was peeling in places and the furniture was second-hand, she kept everything immaculately clean. On the windowsill, a small collection of potted plants thrived against all odds, their green leaves a stark contrast to the bleakness of the city outside. They were a gift from her sister, who had moved to Atlanta years ago in search of better opportunities. Janice had often thought about leaving Detroit herself, but something always held her back, a stubborn loyalty to the city that had both raised her and let her down. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate and careful. The baby's weight pulled at her back, and a dull ache spread across her lower spine. She shuffled to the kitchen, where a small grocery list was taped to the fridge. It was a short list: eggs, milk, some fresh fruit, but she had to stretch every dollar. Her job as a receptionist at a local clinic barely covered rent and utilities, let alone anything extra. She glanced at the list, sighed, and grabbed her coat from the hook by the door. It was worn, but warm, its seams straining against her growing belly. She wrapped a scarf around her neck, knowing the November wind would be unforgiving. Outside, the city greeted her with its usual mix of decay and determination. Detroit was a city of contradictions. For every abandoned building with boarded-up windows, there was a street corner where life thrived. Kids playing, neighbors chatting, food trucks serving up meals to long lines of hungry patrons. As Janice walked toward the bus stop, she passed familiar sights. The mural of a jazz musician painted on the side of a bar, the church with its steeple leaning precariously to one side, the corner store where Mr. Patel always greeted her with a kind smile. Her footsteps echoed on the cracked pavement, mingling with the sounds of the city. A group of teenage boys played basketball in an empty lot, their laughter sharp and carefree. She envied their lightness, their ability to find joy amid the grayness. As she passed them, one of the boys called out, "Hey, lady, you sure you're not carrying twins in there?" His friends erupted in laughter, and Janice quickened her pace, her cheeks burning. She knew they didn't mean harm, but the comment stung nonetheless. The bus stop came into view, a small metal shelter with a faded bench beneath it. A few people were already waiting. A man in his 60s leaning heavily on a cane, a young woman in scrubs scrolling through her phone, and a mother with a toddler in tow. Janice lowered herself onto the bench with a sigh, placing her grocery bag beside her. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as a gust of wind swept through the street. Sitting there, she allowed her thoughts to wander. She thought about her baby, about the life growing inside her, and the world she would soon bring them into. It wasn't just the physical struggles that worried her, it was the state of the world itself. Detroit had a way of breaking even the strongest spirits, and she couldn't bear the thought of her child growing up in an environment filled with so much hardship. But what could she do? Her resources were limited, and the idea of starting fresh somewhere else felt impossible. Her mind drifted to the baby's father, a man who had promised her the world and delivered nothing. He was gone now, vanished the moment responsibility loomed. She had tried to make peace with his absence, but the hurt lingered. She wondered if her child would ever ask about him, and if so, what she would say. She resolved to focus on the future, to give her baby the love and stability they deserved, even if she had to do it alone. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced up and saw a group of teenagers approaching the bus stop. There were 3 of them, all boys, dressed in hoodies and sneakers that seemed too clean for the gritty streets they walked. They moved with a kind of casual arrogance, their laughter loud and sharp. Janice tensed as they drew closer, her instincts warning her of trouble. She looked away, hoping they would pass by, but they stopped at the bus stop, their voices drowning out the quiet conversations of the other passengers. The boys didn't seem to notice her at first, their attention focused on teasing each other, but then one of them, a tall boy with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, turned his gaze toward her. "Yo, check her out," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Damn, lady, you look like you're about to pop." Janice felt her face flush. She gripped the edge of the bench, willing herself to stay calm. She had dealt with her share of rude comments before, but something about the way these boys laughed made her feel small and vulnerable. The tall boy nudged his friend, a shorter kid with a buzz cut. "Bet she's got a whole football team in there." "Or maybe she doesn't even know who the dad is," the third boy added, his tone cruel. Their laughter echoed in her ears, and for a moment she felt like crying. But she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she focused on her breathing, counting each inhale and exhale in her mind. She glanced at the other people at the bus stop, hoping for some support, but no one met her gaze. The man with the cane shifted uncomfortably, and the woman in scrubs kept her eyes glued to her phone. Janice's heart sank. She felt utterly alone. One of the boys stepped closer, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement. He reached for the grocery bag beside her and tipped it over with a careless shove. An orange rolled out and landed at his feet. He picked it up and tossed it in the air like a baseball. "Oops," he said, grinning. "Didn't mean to do that." Janice's hands balled into fists, her anger simmering beneath the surface. She wanted to stand up to say something, but the weight of her pregnancy and the fear of escalation held her back. As the boys continued their taunts, she felt the world closing in around her. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed someone approaching. A man in a black hoodie, his face partially obscured by the shadow of the fabric. He moved with purpose, his stride steady and deliberate. Janice didn't recognize him at first, but there was something about his presence that commanded attention. The man stopped a few feet away, his gaze locking onto the boys with a quiet intensity. Janice's breath caught in her throat as she realized who he was. Eminem. Janice's pulse quickened as the tension thickened around her. The laughter of the boys cut through the cold Detroit air, loud and sharp against the stillness of the bus stop. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clenched them into fists, her breath shallow and uneven. She could feel the heat of embarrassment and anger spreading across her face. The young men had gone from cruel jokes to outright provocation, their mocking voices rising with each word. The tall one, The apparent leader of the group bent down and picked up another orange from her spilled groceries. He held it up with exaggerated reverence, turning it in his hand as if inspecting a rare artifact. "What is this? Food for the little one?" he sneered, holding it up to his friends. "Or maybe for the daddy who's nowhere to be found." His words were laced with venom, and the group erupted into laughter. Janice felt a lump rise in her throat, her helplessness magnified by the weight of her pregnancy and the freezing wind cutting through her scarf. She wanted to tell them to stop, to stand up and defend herself, but the fear of confrontation paralyzed her. She glanced around the bus stop again, silently pleading for someone, anyone, to step in. The elderly man with the cane looked down, his knuckles white as he gripped his wooden support. The woman in scrubs took a step back, pretending to scroll more intently on her phone. The mother with the toddler whispered something to her child and moved further down the sidewalk, deliberately distancing herself from the commotion. Janice swallowed hard, her stomach tightening with despair. She felt utterly alone. The boys continued their antics, their energy growing more chaotic. The shorter one, emboldened by the laughter of his friends, stepped closer and kicked over her bag entirely, spilling the remaining contents onto the grimy pavement. A small carton of eggs cracked open, the yolks spreading like a fragile yellow stain on the cold concrete. "Oops," the shorter boy said with a mock apology, shrugging exaggeratedly. "Guess I don't know my own strength." His friends howled with laughter, their voices bouncing off the nearby brick buildings. The tall boy crouched down, grabbing her scarf from the puddle where it had fallen earlier. He held it up like a trophy, the damp fabric dripping onto the ground. "Looks like you've got enough problems, lady," he said, his tone almost gleeful. "Maybe you should have stayed home where you belong." Janice could feel her body trembling, tears threatening to spill over. But then, like a shift in the atmosphere, she noticed a new presence approaching. It wasn't loud or sudden, just a steady, deliberate stride that carried an undeniable weight. The laughter of the boys faltered for a moment as they glanced toward the source of the movement. The man in the black hoodie stopped a few feet away. He was lean, but carried himself with a presence that immediately commanded attention. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hood, but the sharpness of his features and the intensity of his gaze left no doubt as to his identity. Even before Janice fully registered who he was, she could feel the energy around him shift, the air growing taut with anticipation. Eminem. For a moment, the group froze, their confidence wavering under his scrutinizing glare. The tall boy was the first to recover, his smirk returning as he straightened up, still clutching the damp scarf in his hand. "Yo, isn't that?" One of the other boys started, but the leader cut him off. "So what?" the tall one said, his voice laced with feigned bravado. "What's he gonna do? Rap us to death?" His friends chuckled nervously, but the unease was palpable. Eminem didn't move, his piercing gaze locked on the group. He finally spoke, his voice low and measured, each word cutting through the tension like a blade. "Pick it up." The tall boy blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "The scarf. Pick it up, now." There was no mistaking the authority in his tone. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that demanded obedience. The tall boy hesitated, his smirk faltering. "And apologize," Eminem added, his eyes narrowing. "To her." The boy laughed nervously, glancing at his friends for backup. "Man, you serious? We were just messing around. Ain't that right, lady?" Janice didn't respond. She couldn't find her voice, her shock at the sudden turn of events rendering her silent. She watched as Eminem took a step closer, his posture relaxed but his presence undeniably threatening. Does it look like she's laughing? He said, his voice dropping even lower. You think this is funny? Making her cry? Making her feel like she doesn't belong? You're nothing but cowards. The word hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The boys shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado slipping away. Hey, man, we didn't mean nothing by it, the shorter boy muttered, his eyes darting to the ground. Eminem's gaze didn't waver. Pick it up. The tall boy scowled but bent down, grabbing the scarf from the ground. He shoved it back toward Janice, muttering a half-hearted sorry under his breath. That's not good enough, Eminem said, his tone as sharp as ever. Say it like you mean it, and pick up the rest of her stuff while you're at it. Reluctantly, the boys scrambled to gather Janice's spilled groceries, their movements hurried and clumsy. The tension was thick as they placed the damaged items back into her bag. When they finally finished, the tall boy turned back to Eminem, his defiance dimmed but not extinguished. Whatever, man, he mumbled. We're out of here. Good, Eminem said, his voice dripping with disdain. And if I ever see you pulling this kind of crap again, we'll have a real problem. Got it? The boys didn't respond. They turned and walked away, their laughter replaced by sullen silence. Eminem watched them until they disappeared around the corner before turning his attention to Janice. You okay? He asked, his voice softening. Janice nodded, though her hands were still trembling. I think so, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Eminem crouched down, picking up the remaining items the boys had missed. He handed her the bag, his expression gentler now. Here, he said. I think this is everything. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking. Tears filled her eyes as the weight of the moment finally hit her. I didn't know what to do. They wouldn't stop. You don't have to explain, he said, standing up. People like that, bullies, they feed off fear, but they're just noise. Don't let them get to you. Janice wiped at her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She looked up at him, her gratitude mingled with disbelief. You didn't have to step in, but you did. Thank you. Eminem shrugged, shoving his hands into the pockets of his hoodie. Yeah, well, somebody had to. The bus pulled up to the stop with a hiss of brakes, breaking the silence. Janice hesitated, unsure if she was ready to leave just yet, but Eminem gestured toward the open door. Go on, he said. You don't want to miss it. She nodded, stepping toward the bus, but something made her pause. Turning back, she looked at him, her voice steadier now. You're not like I thought you'd be. Eminem raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Good or bad? Good, she said simply. Better. He didn't respond, just gave her a small nod as she boarded the bus. As the doors closed behind her, Janice watched him through the window, standing there in the cold, his hood pulled up, his hands still in his pockets. He looked smaller somehow, but no less commanding. As the bus pulled away, she clutched her bag tightly, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt something new, a flicker of hope. The bus doors hissed shut behind Janice, but her mind lingered on the man she had just encountered. She sat down, gingerly, still clutching her grocery bag, her fingers tightening around the handles as if they were a lifeline. Outside, the world moved in a blur, but her focus remained on the image of him standing at the bus stop. He had been a sudden force of calm in the chaos, a shield against a storm she hadn't known how to weather. His presence had changed the course of the morning entirely. The bus jolted forward, pulling her back to reality. Around her, passengers scrolled through their phones or stared blankly out the windows, their expressions distant. No one seemed to have noticed the significance of what had just happened. It was just another day in Detroit, another confrontation in a city that never stopped challenging its residents. But for Janice, it felt monumental. She couldn't shake the memory of his voice, low and commanding, cutting through the taunts of the boys like a blade. Her thoughts drifted back to the boys themselves. She replayed their sneering faces, the way they had laughed at her pain. The humiliation still burned, and her heart raced as she recalled their words. It wasn't the first time she'd faced discrimination or cruelty, but today it had felt different, more personal, more cutting. She wondered if they had any idea of the weight she carried, not just in her growing belly, but in her heart. She looked down at her lap, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. The baby moved slightly, a gentle flutter that brought tears to her eyes. "We're okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "We're okay now." The bus rattled through the streets, stopping periodically to let passengers on and off. Janice barely noticed the change in faces around her. Her mind kept circling back to the man who had intervened. She hadn't fully realized who he was until she'd been on the bus, replaying his face in her mind. Eminem. It seemed surreal, almost impossible, but there was no mistaking it now. She'd seen his face on album covers, heard his voice on the radio, even caught glimpses of him on television. And yet, there he had been, standing in the cold, defending her like it was the most natural thing in the world. As the bus neared her stop, Janice gathered her belongings and stood, her movements slow and careful. She felt the weight of the morning pressing down on her, but there was also a strange sense of lightness, like a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. She stepped off the bus and into the chill of the late morning, the wind biting at her cheeks as she adjusted her scarf. Her apartment felt warmer than usual when she stepped inside, though it was probably just the contrast to the icy streets outside. She set her bag down on the counter and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. The events of the morning swirled in her mind, each moment vivid and raw. She thought about how close she had come to breaking down, to letting the boy's words destroy her. And then she thought about how he had stepped in, the way his presence had shifted everything. It wasn't just his fame that had made a difference. It was his humanity, the simple act of standing up for someone who needed it. Janice spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet reflection. She prepared a simple lunch, sat by the window with a cup of tea, and let her thoughts wander. She thought about her child and the kind of world she wanted to bring them into. She thought about her past, the struggles she had faced, and the moments of kindness that had kept her going. And she thought about him, the man in the hoodie, whose actions had reminded her that even in the harshest moments, there was still room for compassion. As evening fell, Janice found herself scrolling through her phone, looking up articles and videos about Eminem. She had known of him, of course. Who didn't? But she had never paid much attention to his music or his story. Now, though, she was curious. She read about his upbringing in Detroit, his struggles with poverty and addiction, his rise to fame against all odds. The more she learned, the more she understood the depth of his actions that morning. He wasn't just a celebrity who had happened to be in the right place at the right time. He was someone who knew what it meant to fight, to struggle, to survive. The next day, Janice woke up early, her thoughts still preoccupied with the events of the day before. She decided to visit the community center a few blocks away, where she sometimes volunteered to help organize donations. It was a small, unassuming building with peeling paint and a hand-painted sign, but it was a place that had always felt welcoming to her. She hoped that immersing herself in something productive might help her process everything that had happened. When she arrived, the center was buzzing with activity. Volunteers sorted through boxes of clothes and food, while a group of children played noisily in the corner. Janice smiled as she joined the others, her hands finding purpose in the simple task of folding clothes and organizing shelves. The familiar routine brought her a sense of peace, but her mind kept drifting back to the bus stop. As the day went on, she found herself sharing the story with one of the other volunteers, a middle-aged woman named Clara, who had become a friend over the past few months. Clara listened intently, her hands pausing in their work as Janice recounted the details. "He just stepped in," Janice said, her voice filled with awe, like it was nothing. "He didn't hesitate, didn't even seem to think about it. He just acted." Clara shook her head, a smile spreading across her face. "Sounds like you met a real-life hero." Janice laughed softly, though there was a note of emotion in her voice. "It felt like that. I mean, I know he's just a person like anyone else, but in that moment, it was exactly what I needed." The conversation left Janice feeling lighter, her heart warmed by the memory. She realized that the experience had given her more than just a sense of safety in the moment. It had restored a piece of her faith in humanity. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope for the future. That evening, as she sat by the window with her tea, Janice thought about how she might one day tell her child this story. She imagined their curious eyes looking up at her as she described the man who had stood up for her when she needed it most. She hoped it would teach them something about courage and kindness, about the importance of standing up for what's right. And she hoped it would remind them that even in a world full of challenges, there were still moments of light. As the city settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm, Janice felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. The next day, the sky over Detroit was a dull, leaden gray. Janice watched through the streaked windows of her apartment as the wind rattled the branches of the skeletal trees outside. She had planned to stay in, to take it easy after the stress of the previous day, but her thoughts were restless. No matter how much she tried to distract herself, her mind kept circling back to the encounter at the bus stop, to the man who had appeared so unexpectedly and shifted the trajectory of her day. By mid-afternoon, a persistent drizzle began to fall, soft and steady. The rhythmic tapping against the window seemed to match the rhythm of her thoughts, and eventually she gave in to the urge to go outside. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but she felt the need to move, to let the city guide her steps. Wrapping herself in her warmest coat and scarf, she stepped out into the cool, damp air. The streets were quieter than usual, the rain driving most people indoors. Her boots splashed through shallow puddles as she made her way toward the neighborhood park. It wasn't much, a small patch of green, bordered by rusted fences and cracked sidewalks, but it had always been a place of solace for her. She found herself gravitating there now, seeking the peace it offered. As she approached the park, she noticed a figure sitting on one of the benches under the shelter of a large oak tree. At first, she didn't recognize him, his hood pulled low over his face, his posture relaxed yet somehow alert. But as she drew closer, a flicker of recognition sparked in her chest. It was him. Eminem sat there, seemingly lost in thought, the rain misting around him as if reluctant to intrude. He glanced up as she approached, his sharp eyes meeting hers. For a moment, Neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy with the unspoken weight of the previous day's events. "You again," he said finally, his voice low and slightly rough, but not unkind. "Didn't think I'd run into you." Janice hesitated, unsure of what to say. She hadn't expected to see him again, and now that she had, she wasn't sure how to handle the swirl of emotions that rose within her. Gratitude, curiosity, even a touch of awe. "I wasn't expecting to see you either," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. I wanted to thank you for yesterday. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." He shrugged, the movement almost dismissive. "You don't have to thank me. It was the right thing to do." Janice nodded, though she couldn't help but feel that his words didn't fully capture the gravity of what he had done. She hesitated, then gestured toward the empty space on the bench. "Mind if I sit?" He shifted slightly, making room. "Go ahead." She lowered herself onto the bench, careful of her belly, and pulled her coat tighter against the chill. The sound of the rain filled the silence between them, a soothing backdrop that made the quiet feel less awkward. "You really didn't have to do that," she said after a moment, her voice tentative. "Most people wouldn't have." Eminem turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. "Most people don't. That's the problem." His words hung in the air, and Janice found herself nodding in agreement. She thought about the others at the bus stop, how they had turned away or pretended not to see what was happening. It had made her feel invisible, as if her pain didn't matter. "You've probably seen your share of that," he said, as if reading her thoughts. She looked at him, surprised by the insight in his tone. "More than I care to admit." He nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he stared out at the rain. "I get it. People think they can get away with anything when they know no one's gonna call them out." Janice studied him, noticing the tension in his jaw, the way his hands rested in his lap, clenched just enough to suggest he was holding something back. She wondered what had shaped him into the man who had stood up for her so fiercely. "Why did you?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. "Why step in? You didn't even know me." He glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "Doesn't matter if I knew you. What mattered was that they were wrong, and someone needed to tell them." His answer was simple, but it carried a depth that resonated with her. She felt a lump rise in her throat, her emotions stirred by the sincerity in his voice. "Have you always been like that?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Willing to stand up for people?" Eminem let out a short, dry laugh. "Not always. Took me a while to figure out how to do it right. Growing up here, you learn to pick your battles. But some things you can't ignore." Janice nodded, understanding more than she could put into words. She thought about her own life, the battles she had fought silently, the moments when she had wished someone, anyone, would stand beside her. The conversation shifted, the two of them exchanging pieces of their stories. Janice told him about her pregnancy, the challenges she faced as a single mother-to-be in a city that often felt like it was working against her. She spoke of the fear that kept her up at night, the uncertainty of how she would provide for her child. Her voice wavered as she admitted how alone she often felt. Eminem listened intently, his expression thoughtful. When it was his turn, he shared fragments of his own struggles, growing up in poverty, feeling like the odds were stacked against him and the fight to prove himself in a world that didn't believe in him. His words were raw, unpolished, but they carried a weight that made them impossible to ignore. "It's not easy," he said finally, his voice quieter now. living in a place like this with everything stacked against you, but you're tougher than you think." Janice looked at him, her eyes searching his face for the truth in his words. "How do you know?" "Because you're still here," he said simply. "That counts for more than you realize." The rain began to lighten, the drizzle softening to a faint mist. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the city unusually quiet in the damp air. Janice felt a sense of calm settle over her, as if the storm inside her had finally started to subside. As the conversation wound down, she found herself feeling lighter, her burdens less suffocating. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he listened, that made her believe she wasn't as alone as she had thought. When it was time to leave, she hesitated, unsure of how to express the depth of her gratitude. She stood, adjusting her scarf, and turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her chest. "For everything. Not just yesterday, but for this. For listening." He nodded, his hood still pulled low over his face. "Take care of yourself. And your kid." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I will." As she walked away, the sound of the rain fading behind her, she felt a newfound sense of strength. The man in the hoodie had reminded her of something she had nearly forgotten, that even in the hardest moments, there were people willing to stand by her side. And for the first time in a long time, she believed she could face whatever came next. As Janice walked away from the park, the conversation with Eminem lingered in her thoughts like a melody that refused to fade. His words resonated with her, their simplicity belying the depth of their impact. She had never expected to find herself sharing such personal fears and struggles with a stranger, let alone someone like him, whose world seemed so far removed from her own. Yet, in that brief exchange, she had felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. The city seemed quieter as she made her way back to her apartment, the damp streets glistening under the dim light of the overcast sky. Janice's steps were slow and deliberate, her thoughts turning inward. Each footfall seemed to unearth memories she had tried to bury, fragments of her past that rose unbidden, demanding her attention. Her apartment felt colder than usual when she returned, the rain outside casting a gray pall over everything. She set her bag down on the kitchen counter and sank into the couch, the weight of the day settling over her like a heavy blanket. For a moment, she simply sat there, staring at the flickering flame of a candle she had lit earlier, letting the silence envelop her. But the stillness didn't last long. Her mind began to wander, sifting through the moments that had shaped her life, the choices that had led her to this point. She thought about her childhood, growing up in a small, cramped house on Detroit's East Side. Her parents had worked tirelessly, her father taking shifts at a manufacturing plant while her mother cleaned houses in the wealthier suburbs. They had dreamed of a better life for Janice and her siblings, but the weight of systemic inequities and financial strain had often left them struggling to make ends meet. Janice remembered the evenings when her father would come home, his hands rough and calloused, his face lined with exhaustion. He would sit at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills while her mother quietly prepared dinner. Despite their struggles, her parents had always tried to shield their children from the harshness of their reality. They spoke of hope and resilience, of the importance of education and hard work. But, even as a child, Janice had sensed the undercurrent of despair that ran through their lives. Her thoughts drifted to her teenage years, a time when she had begun to understand the full extent of the challenges her family faced. She had excelled in school, driven by a determination to escape the cycle of poverty that seemed to trap so many in her community. Yet, despite her best efforts, the weight of her circumstances often felt insurmountable. Janice remembered the day she had received her acceptance letter to a university out of state. It had been a moment of triumph, a validation of all her hard work. But the elation had been short-lived. The cost of tuition, even with financial aid, had been beyond her family's means. She had been forced to turn down the opportunity, her dreams of a brighter future slipping through her fingers like sand. Her 20s had been a blur of dead-end jobs and unfulfilled potential. She had worked as a cashier, a server, a receptionist, anything to keep the lights on and food on the table. Each job had brought its own set of challenges, from condescending bosses to rude customers who saw her as little more than a background fixture in their lives. Through it all, she had clung to the hope that things would get better, that her perseverance would eventually pay off. But life had a way of testing her resolve. The father of her child, a man she had once trusted and loved, had walked away as soon as the responsibilities of parenthood became real. His departure had left her reeling, her heart heavy with betrayal and sorrow. Yet, even in the face of his abandonment, she had refused to give up. She had resolved to raise her child on her own, to provide them with the love and stability she had always longed for. Janice's thoughts shifted to more recent memories, moments that had reminded her of the resilience she had inherited from her parents. She thought about the times she had volunteered at the community center, organizing donations and helping families in need. Those moments had been a source of solace, a reminder that even in the midst of her own struggles, she could still make a difference in someone else's life. She also thought about the small acts of kindness that had punctuated her days: a smile from a stranger, a coworker offering to cover her shift, a neighbor helping her carry groceries. These moments had been like rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds, small but significant reminders of the goodness that still existed in the world. And then there was yesterday. The memory of the boys at the bus stop, their sneering faces and cruel laughter, made her stomach twist with anger and humiliation. But alongside that memory was the image of Eminem, standing tall and unyielding, his presence a shield against their aggression. His actions had been a stark contrast to the apathy of the others at the bus stop, a powerful reminder that courage could take many forms. Janice leaned back against the couch, her hands resting on her belly. She thought about the future, about the life she wanted to create for her child. She wanted them to grow up in a world where they felt safe and valued, where they could dream without fear of those dreams being crushed. But she also knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a message from Clara, her friend from the community center. Clara had heard about the incident at the bus stop and had sent a message of support, along with an invitation to meet for coffee later in the week. Janice smiled, her heart warmed by the gesture. She typed out a quick response, expressing her gratitude and agreeing to the meeting. It was a small moment, but it reminded her that she wasn't entirely alone in her journey. As the evening wore on, Janice found herself reflecting on the conversation she had shared with Eminem. His words had been simple, but they had carried a depth of understanding that had resonated with her. She wondered about his own struggles, about the experiences that had shaped him into the man he was. She found herself curious about his music, about the stories he had woven into his lyrics. She opened her laptop and began to search for some of his songs, her curiosity piqued. As she listened, she was struck by the raw honesty of his words, the way he laid bare his pain and vulnerability. It was a form of expression that felt both cathartic and courageous, a testament to the power of storytelling. The music seemed to echo her own experiences in some ways, the struggles and triumphs she had faced. It reminded her that she wasn't alone, that others had walked similar paths and emerged stronger for it. As the night deepened, Janice closed her laptop and sat in the quiet of her apartment, her thoughts a mixture of reflection and resolve. She didn't have all the answers, and she knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But, for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope, a belief that, despite everything, she could find a way to create the life she wanted for her child. And perhaps, she thought, she could even inspire them to believe in the goodness of people, in the power of courage and kindness. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that even in the darkest moments, light could still find a way through. The following days brought a subtle but persistent shift in Janice's perspective. The memory of her encounter with Eminem and the courage he had shown lingered like a warm ember in her chest. It wasn't just the fact that he had stood up for her, it was the way he had done it, with quiet conviction and a refusal to back down. That moment, and the brief conversation they'd shared afterward, had stayed with her, rekindling a hope she hadn't realized she had lost. Despite this newfound spark of strength, life continued to test her resolve. Detroit was relentless in its challenges, and Janice felt their weight as she navigated her daily routine. Yet, something had changed. She noticed moments of kindness and solidarity more acutely now, like when a stranger held the door for her at the grocery store or when her neighbor offered to carry her bags up the stairs. These small acts, once easy to overlook, now seemed to glimmer with significance, reminders that the world wasn't entirely bleak. On a gray afternoon, a week after the incident at the bus stop, Janice decided to visit the community center. It had always been a place of refuge for her, a space where she could focus on helping others and momentarily set aside her own worries. She arrived to find the center bustling with activity. Volunteers moved purposefully through the main hall, sorting donations, assembling care packages, and chatting as they worked. The hum of voices and the clatter of boxes created a sense of vitality that immediately lifted her spirits. As Janice began sorting through a pile of donated clothes, Clara approached her, a warm smile spreading across her face. Clara was in her late 40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor that belied her deeply compassionate nature. She had become something of a mentor to Janice, always ready with advice or a listening ear. "Glad you could make it," Clara said, handing Janice a cup of tea. "I was hoping you'd stop by." Janice accepted the tea gratefully, the warmth seeping into her chilled hands. "I needed to get out of the house," she admitted. "It's been a lot lately." Clara's eyes softened with understanding. "I heard about what happened at the bus stop. How are you holding up?" Janice hesitated, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. "I'm okay, I think," she said finally. "It was scary, but something good came out of it too." Clara tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her expression. "Oh?" Janice recounted the incident in detail, from the moment the boys began their taunts to the unexpected intervention by Eminem. As she spoke, she watched Clara's expression shift from concern to admiration, her eyes widening slightly at the mention of his name. "Wait," Clara said, holding up a hand. "You're telling me Eminem stood up for you?" Janice nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I couldn't believe it at first either, but he was amazing. He didn't just scare them off, he really made them think about what they were doing." Clara shook her head in amazement. That's incredible, and it sounds like he left quite an impression on you. Janice's smile grew. He did. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it, like he really understood. Clara nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes it takes someone who's been through their own struggles to truly see someone else's. And it sounds like he saw you. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of sorting clothes providing a soothing backdrop to their thoughts. As Janice folded a soft, worn sweater, she found herself thinking about the importance of moments like these, moments of connection and understanding. She wondered how many people went through life feeling unseen, their struggles invisible to those around them. The sound of raised voices interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see a small commotion near the entrance, where a group of people had gathered. At the center of the group was a young man holding a phone, his expression animated as he showed something to the others. Curious, Janice and Clara moved closer to investigate. As they approached, they caught snippets of conversation. "It's him," someone said. "I swear it's him," another voice chimed in. "This video's been everywhere. People are really talking about it." Janice's heart skipped a beat. She edged closer, her eyes fixed on the phone. The young man was showing a video, and though the audio was faint, she could hear the familiar cadence of Eminem's voice. The image on the screen confirmed it. It was a recording of the confrontation at the bus stop. The video had been taken by a bystander, someone Janice hadn't even noticed at the time. It showed the boys' taunts, the spilled groceries, and then the moment Eminem stepped in. His words were clear, his tone firm and unyielding. The video ended with the boys retreating and Eminem helping Janice gather her things. "That's me," Janice said softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. The group turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and curiosity. The young man with the phone stared at her for a moment, then broke into a grin. "No way," he said. "You're the woman in the video?" Janice nodded, feeling a mix of emotions, pride, embarrassment, and a lingering sense of vulnerability. "Yeah, that's me." The group erupted into murmurs, some expressing admiration, others shaking their heads at the boy's behavior. Clara placed a reassuring hand on Janice's shoulder, her gaze steady. "Looks like your story's made an impact," Clara said, her voice low but filled with warmth. "People are paying attention." Over the next few days, the video continued to spread. Janice's phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and acquaintances who had seen it. Some shared words of support, while others expressed outrage at the boys' actions. The video sparked a wave of conversations online, with people sharing their own experiences of prejudice and bullying. It was as if a ripple had been set in motion, one small act of courage creating waves of reflection and change. Janice found herself at the center of these discussions, her story becoming a catalyst for broader conversations about race, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. At first, the attention was overwhelming. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the idea of strangers discussing her life felt intrusive. But as she read the comments and messages, she began to see the impact her story was having. People were connecting with her experiences, drawing strength from her perseverance. One evening, as she scrolled through the flood of messages, she came across a post that stopped her in her tracks. It was from a young woman who had been inspired by the video to confront her own bullies at school. The woman wrote about how she had found the courage to stand up for herself thanks to Janice's story. Janice stared at the screen, her chest tight with emotion. She hadn't set out to inspire anyone. She had simply been trying to survive. Yet, somehow, her story had become a beacon for others, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, strength and kindness could prevail. The following day, as she walked to the community center, Janice felt a renewed sense of purpose. She thought about Eminem, about the way he had stepped in without hesitation. And she realized that his actions had set something in motion. He had reminded her, and countless others, that even small acts of courage could create ripples of change. As she entered the center, greeted by the familiar buzz of activity, Janice felt a sense of unity she hadn't experienced in a long time. She was no longer just a single mother-to-be navigating a challenging world. She was part of something larger, a community bound by shared struggles and a collective desire for a better future. And for the first time in years, she felt truly hopeful. Janice's days took on a new rhythm after the video went viral. What had started as an ordinary moment of cruelty at a bus stop had blossomed into something far greater, a conversation that spanned neighborhoods, communities, and even the far reaches of social media. Each morning, she woke to find her phone buzzing with messages and notifications as people shared their stories of resilience and solidarity in response to her own. It was humbling, empowering, and at times overwhelming. At the community center, Clara had taken to calling her a local celebrity. It was meant as a joke, but there was a kernel of truth in it. People recognized Janice now, on the streets, at the grocery store, even on the bus. Most were kind, offering words of encouragement or expressing their gratitude for her courage. A few seemed skeptical or indifferent, but Janice had learned to focus on the positive. She couldn't control how others reacted. She could only stay true to herself. Despite the growing attention, Janice remained grounded. Her life had always been rooted in practicality, and even now, as her story became a beacon for others, she still had groceries to buy, bills to pay, and a baby to prepare for. Yet something had shifted inside her. The sense of isolation that had weighed on her for so long was beginning to lift, replaced by a quiet but steadfast hope. One afternoon, as she folded clothes at the community center, Clara approached her with a sly smile. "You've got a visitor," she said, her tone teasing. Janice raised an eyebrow. "A visitor? Here?" Clara nodded toward the entrance, where a figure in a black hoodie stood, leaning casually against the doorframe. Even with the hood pulled low over his face, there was no mistaking who it was. Janice's breath caught in her throat as Eminem stepped inside, his sharp gaze scanning the room until it landed on her. "Hey," he said, his voice as casual as if they'd seen each other just yesterday. Janice blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. "Hey," she managed, setting the folded shirt in her hands onto the table. "I wasn't expecting to see you again." He shrugged, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Figured I'd stop by. Thought maybe we could talk." Clara shot Janice a grin before retreating to the back room, leaving them alone. Janice gestured to a quieter corner of the center where they could sit and talk without interruption. As they settled into the worn chairs, she noticed a subtle tension in his posture, as if he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. "You've been busy," he said, nodding toward her phone, which buzzed faintly on the table between them. Janice smiled wryly. "You could say that. The video really took off. I wasn't expecting it to get this much attention." He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's a good thing, though. People need to see this kind of stuff, need to talk about it." She nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It's been a lot to take in. I never wanted to be the center of attention, but if it helps people, I guess it's worth it." He studied her for a moment, his piercing eyes seeming to look right through her. "You're handling it better than most would," he said finally. "This kind of thing, it's not easy, but you're doing it right." Janice felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. Coming from him, they carried a weight that felt deeply meaningful. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm just trying to make the best of it." Their conversation shifted naturally, flowing between topics like two old friends catching up. Eminem spoke about his own experiences with fame and the pressures that came with it, his tone candid and unfiltered. Janice shared more about her life, the struggles she'd faced as a single mother-to-be, and the fears that kept her awake at night. At one point, she hesitated, her words faltering as a thought took shape in her mind. "Do you ever feel like the world expects you to be something you're not?" she asked, her voice tinged with vulnerability. Eminem's lips quirked into a faint smile. "All the time," he said. "But at the end of the day, the only person you really need to answer to is yourself. As long as you're doing what feels right, screw what anyone else thinks." His words struck a chord in Janice, resonating with a truth she hadn't fully acknowledged before. For so long, she had tried to fit into a mold that wasn't hers, to meet expectations that felt impossible to achieve. But here was someone who had faced his own battles, who had carved out a path for himself despite the odds, telling her that it was okay to just be herself. Their conversation stretched on, the hours slipping by unnoticed. By the time they realized how late it had become, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light through the windows of the center. Janice felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in months, as if the weight she carried had been lifted, if only for a little while. Before he left, Eminem reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. He handed it to her, his expression serious. "If you ever need anything," he said, "call this number. I mean it." Janice took the card, her fingers brushing against the textured paper. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." He nodded, his hood casting a shadow over his face. "Take care of yourself," he said, "and that kid." With that, he turned and walked out, the door closing softly behind him. Janice sat there for a moment, staring at the card in her hand, before tucking it carefully into her pocket. She knew she might never use it, but just knowing it was there filled her with a sense of reassurance. In the days that followed, Janice found herself reflecting on their conversation. It wasn't just his words that had stayed with her, it was the way he had listened, the way he had made her feel like her story mattered. She realized that his actions, both at the bus stop and afterward, had taught her something important. That even in a world filled with hardship, there was still room for kindness and courage. As her due date drew closer, Janice began to focus more on the future. She started preparing her apartment for the baby, organizing the small nursery she had set up in the corner of her bedroom. Friends from the community center pitched in, donating clothes and toys, while Clara helped her assemble a crib. Each day brought new challenges, but also new moments of joy, as she imagined the life she was about to bring into the world. One evening, as she sat in the nursery, folding tiny onesies and humming softly to herself, she thought about the lessons she wanted to pass on to her child. She wanted them to grow up knowing that they were loved, that their voice mattered, and that they had the strength to face whatever challenges came their way. She thought about the story she would one day tell them, the story of a man in a black hoodie who had stood up for her when no one else would. She hoped it would teach them about the power of standing up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. And perhaps, she thought, it would also remind them that even in the darkest moments, there was always a light to be found if you were willing to look for it. As the city settled into its quiet, nighttime rhythm, Janice felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face it, one step at a time. Because now, she knew she wasn't walking it alone. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to stay tuned for more powerful moments and inspiring stories. Check out our other videos for more, and don't forget to share this one with your friends. It's a message the world needs to hear.